In this video, I'm going to teach you all about EQ, all the way from the basics and the very fundamentals and what you need to get started to advanced techniques that you can use to make your sound system sound great. A lot of worship leaders and musicians are responsible for their own audio, but they haven't gotten the training they need to pass it along to somebody else to support them. I'm here to help you eliminate the mystery and frustration with sound at church. So if that's you, you're in the right place. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Equalization, or EQ for short, is a way that we can change the balance of different parts of the frequency spectrum. Now, what exactly is the frequency spectrum and why would we want to adjust it? Well, we're going to dive in and find out. Sound waves are variations in air pressure that are caused by a vibration, and that vibration can happen at different speeds or different frequencies. Frequencies can range from very low, like the punch of a kick drum or the lowest note on a bass guitar, all the way up to the very highest frequencies we can perceive, which are like the shimmer on cymbals or the breathiness on a vocal. In between those two, we have the middle frequencies, but we'll define those a little bit better in a minute. For the beginner version of EQ, you just have to divide the frequency range into three sections: the lowest frequencies, or the bass frequencies, the highest frequencies, or the treble frequencies, and the middle frequencies, which are in between. When we're thinking about balancing our EQ this way, we're thinking about broad strokes to get the tone into something that's going to fit well within the mix. And before we go too much farther, we have to remember that EQ can be on individual channels or an entire speaker system or an entire mix. If we're EQing individual channels, we're trying to get that individual channel to fit well in a mix, not necessarily just sound good by itself. Dive into that a lot more in a minute. We measure frequency in cycles per second, or how many vibrations go back and forth in 1 second. We call these cycles per second hertz, or you'll see it abbreviated Hz, and above 1,000 we use the metric system, so it'll be kHz. Our ears can perceive frequencies all the way from 20 Hz all the way up to 20,000 Hz. That's a really wide range. If we divide that frequency spectrum into high, middle, and low, we might consider 20 Hz to 200 Hz our low frequencies. Our highest frequencies would probably be from about 4 kHz up to 20,000 Hz. In between 200 and about 4 kHz, or 4K for short, if you hear somebody say that, that's what they usually mean, we'd call that the middle frequency range. We could even go a step further and divide the middle frequencies into upper mids and lower mids. Usually 1 kHz is the dividing line between this. So from 200 to 1K, we might consider that low mids, and from 1K to 4K, we might consider that high mids. Some people might argue about the specifics of what's low mids and what's lows, but that doesn't really matter all that much. We're just trying to make music sound good. If you've ever messed with the equalizer on your home stereo or car stereo, you're probably used to playing around with the sliders that say low, mid, and high, or bass, middle, and treble. Now remember, with EQ, we're trying to change the relative balance of these frequency ranges. If you took the level knob on your home stereo, often mislabeled volume, because sound isn't liquid, we can't measure a quart of sound, at least not that I know of. When you turn up or down that level knob, you're turning all of the frequencies up or down by the same amount. With the EQ, we can take one part of that frequency spectrum and change its balance compared to the other parts. Now, the gain control of our EQ usually rests at 0, meaning we're not adding or subtracting any level from the signal coming in. Before we listen to examples of this on some instruments, we're going to talk about shapes for a second. And no, drummers and bass players, you can put away your crayons. It's not that kind of shapes. I'm talking about the shape of the EQ filter that we're using. On the bass and treble controls on our equalizer, this is using what's called a shelf. Basically, we're turning up the signal at that frequency, usually maybe 100 Hz for the lows and 10 kHz for the highs, and we're turning that up, and then everything above or below that point is getting turned up as well. If you have a pro audio console, sometimes the high and low bands have this little barbecue fork shape, or it says high shelf or low shelf. The middle frequency control on our basic EQ is called a bell curve. Now, if you took statistics as a math class, you probably would recognize the standard distribution curve, also known as a bell curve. You don't have to remember what percentage lies within a standard deviation or even what sigma means, but I just told you, but we do have to understand that there are frequencies on either side of the center frequency selected that get affected by our bell curve or the middle curve of the EQ. Our frequency is like the average in the middle of the curve, with frequencies on either side being affected when we boost or add level or cut, which means take away level. We'll talk about more of the specifics on this in the intermediate lesson, but that's probably enough for now. Now, backing up to the big picture, we have to remember that balance is our first EQ change, right? The fader adjustment is our broadband EQ. It affects all the frequencies up and down. So if we don't have our fader in the right spot before we EQ, we're kind of chasing our tail and it's gonna get more complicated for us. So we get our faders in the right spot and then we listen and EQ things in context to other stuff because we have to get the balance a little bit more fine-tuned. So on this mix, I've taken the EQ off of everything and it's just the raw tracks coming in from the microphones. So I'm gonna pull up the kick drum first and in context to the other drums, I'm gonna adjust the EQ on the top and the bottom band with a high and low shelf respectively, and you can hear what those are like and how the tone changes overall. So we'll hear the whole mix, then we'll hear just the drums, and then I'll EQ the kick drum in context. Now we can also cut mid-range on the kick drum, but if it's set too wide, eventually that mid-range cut is going to affect our low frequencies as well. So we have to look out for that and we have to listen for it, especially if you're on an analog console and you cannot see the EQ and what the graph is doing overall. You have to listen for when things go away that you did not intend for them to go away. So let's take a listen to that. So it is possible to affect bands that you're not intending to. That's what you have to listen for. Use your ears, not just your eyes on the EQ. So the kick drum is a full range instrument, or it has top and bottom end that we need to balance in the mix. But there are other instruments like a viola in this instance that is a mid-range instrument. So if we're gonna get rid of the noise and the stuff that we don't want, sometimes we will cut top and bottom end so that it's just what we want in the mix. We're not amplifying the stuff that we don't need and making things cluttery. So let's take a listen to the viola.
No other God can be.
Now this is actually overdubbed. Shh, don't tell anybody that live albums are really mostly overdubbed. But if we were on stage, we would have a lot of noise coming into this microphone. Since it was in the studio, it's a lot quieter, but we want to turn down anything that we don't need, and that's going to make our stage noise quieter coming through the PA. Now, if you were in the studio, you might want all that top end of those overtones to make it sound pretty. But when we're trying to make it loud and it's trying to get out on top of a big mix, we want to play safe. So we don't want those scratchy things to jump out and get really loud and hurt somebody. That's why we will turn down the top end on something that could be scratchier, like a violin or viola. Now, when we're taking a look at mid-range instruments that have somewhat of a percussive element to them, like guitars and pianos, we can try to highlight some of the top end or the percussiveness with our high shelf to try to get it to cut through the mix a little bit more while pulling our fader back overall. We can also cut some of the low end to make room for the bass in the mix, because not everything has to be really full. We can make room for other instruments to play that role. That's why we call it mixing. So you heard how the guitar got a little bit lost in the mix with the fader at the same level when we turned off the EQ that's highlighting the top end. And because we got the bass there, we don't need a whole lot of bottom end. We can cut that out just to make more room. Now, I've only been using high and low shelves so far, so it's been really simple. EQ doesn't have to be complicated for us to get things in place and kind of get things to glue together just a little bit more. So you can see that it's not rocket science. We just have to think about what place is this instrument filling in the mix and how can we make it stand out a little bit in its own spot. Just like in other creative things like visual art and cooking, we want to have contrasts. So we have salty and sweet like peanut butter and jelly, or we have light and dark in a painting to help give it some depth and contrast. So in our mixes, we can do the same thing with our EQ. We can make some elements a little bit darker and some elements a little bit brighter so that they contrast one another and they fit in the mix. So our guitar, we made a little bit brighter so that it could stand out without having to be so loud. We could do the same thing with the piano where we can make it a little bit brighter so that it can stand out and cut through a little bit more. So let's listen to that on the piano. Now the piano, compared to the mid-range of the electric guitars, has its own spot in the mix. So we're just making very small, subtle changes on the top and bottom end to get everything to glue together and have its own space. Now, mid-range is tricky, and that's where things tend to get a little bit more cluttery in a mix. If we pull out too much mid-range on a mostly mid-range instrument, we're gonna lose that instrument altogether. We're pulling out what the essence of that instrument is doing in the mix. So let's listen to the electric guitar, and I'm gonna pull out too much mid-range and hear how it kind of goes away, or it just gets quieter overall. So you can hear that wasn't very helpful to do. But maybe let's say we've got a little bit too much scratchiness on the distortion of the electric guitar. What can we do about that? Well, let's take a high shelf and make it a little bit darker, see how that feels. Sometimes we have to make some instruments a little bit darker to make the brighter ones stand out a little bit more. And that's how we balance things with EQ. Again, we've just been using a high shelf, a low shelf, and a mid bell curve. That's all we've done so far, and it really can make a big difference in the way that the tones fit together. Now, one very easy way to step it up another notch is to take your beginner skills and apply the high pass filter. And we call it a high pass filter because everything higher than that point passes. It's a way to cut low frequencies or frequencies below a certain point, and it does it as a slope. So the more you go down, the farther it goes with cutting that frequency. If you're on a Behringer console or a Midas M32, you'll see this labeled low cut. And that makes a little bit more sense for beginners, but everywhere else in audio, they call it a high pass filter, so that's what people are talking about. With it, we can very quickly get rid of the low frequencies that we don't need and make things clearer very, very fast. So let me just push up this mix and I'll start turning on the high pass filter on a bunch of different things, and you can hear how it gets cleaner without losing the essence of each of these instruments. So we didn't lose the essence of anything, and even our low frequency instruments, we're putting a little bit of high pass filter on there because we don't want the low frequencies that we don't need out of those instruments, and it will tend to tighten things up. Now you can take the high pass filter too far and start to lose the essence or the meat of what that instrument is supposed to be doing. So let's take some up too far so that you can kind of get an idea of, oh, this is too much. I need to back it off at that point. So if you can get your balance right and you can get your high pass filter right, then all the rest of your adjustments get a lot easier. So do that even maybe before you try your high and low shelves on your EQ to get things fitting and put it in the right spot. Now, one more note is that EQ is not a substitution for a bad arrangement. So if your arrangement doesn't fit well and the notes and rhythms that everybody's playing don't fit well together, you're gonna have a problem that no soundboard can fix. You need to fix your arrangement and make sure things feel good with just a microphone in front of it and balance on the faders, and then you can take those extra steps with your EQ. Now that you have a little grasp on what EQ does, I have a pro tip for you. Always have a purpose for what your EQ is doing, and don't just mess with stuff and then leave it. If you don't know that it accomplished the purpose you had for it, put it back to flat and start over again. Or just leave it. It might be fine if you don't use any EQ. So if you're listening to something and you think to yourself, hey, this sounds kind of muddy or thuddy or kind of woofy, that might be a good time to use your low shelf and pull out some of the low frequencies on your EQ. So grab that gain knob on the low frequency, turn it to the left to see if that fixes your problem. If it didn't actually do what you wanted it to do, put it back to 0. Or for more immediate results and to get back to where you were, you can hit bypass and engage back and forth on the EQ to see exactly what it's doing, or hear rather, because our eyes aren't really helping us mix as much as our ears are telling us when things sound right. You probably won't blow up anything by testing this back and forth, but you can make a real mess for yourself and anybody else by throwing a bunch of random EQ curves on a bunch of stuff that didn't have any purpose and then leaving them there. In the words of your mother, clean up this mess. I'll say it again. If you're trying to fix something with EQ and your attempt didn't work, start over and try again. So if you've mastered the basic levels of EQ in balancing the lows, middle, and high frequencies, now we can start to get a little bit more fine-tuned with our intermediate approach to equalization. If you're watching this video, you probably come from a musical background, so I'm going to relate it to music a little bit more, and we're going to fine-tune what we can do with our equalizer. Now, the notes on our instruments are related to different frequencies, right? You might have heard of A440, or the A above middle C is referenced to the frequency 440 Hertz. Music is divided up into octaves, and our frequency ranges follow octaves as well. We can cut the frequency number in half to go down an octave, or double it to go up an octave. To keep our reference of A above middle C, or A440, one octave below that would divide the frequency in half, or be 220 Hertz. If we go up an octave from A above middle C, that's going to be 880 Hertz. If you really know your notes and have used ear training to identify what different notes are, sometimes you can use that same ear training to find the note of what it is that you're not liking, and you can reduce that same frequency with your equalizer. Another great benefit of understanding how musical notes and equalization frequencies come together is to know what the frequency range is for different instruments. For instance, a standard tuned guitar, that low E is right around 82 Hertz. On a 4-string bass, the low E string is 41 Hertz. So if somebody's playing guitar and they're playing through different chords and they hit a G chord and that bottom G note really stands out, you could go to about 103 hertz and turn that down some to try to balance out the tone of that instrument. Now, to get a little bit more touchy-feely, we also use tone words to describe different frequency ranges. And this is where it gets a little bit ambiguous and different words have different meanings to different people. But here are some tone words that can help you identify different frequency ranges, whether they're out of proportion by too much or too little. And sometimes having a lot of something is a good thing, and sometimes having a lot of something is a bad thing. And we have different words for how those feel. So I'll go from the lower frequencies to the higher frequencies and talk about some of the terms that I use and that I've heard other engineers and audio type people use, so that you can start to identify what you're feeling with your ears and then start applying that to what it looks like on an EQ to kind of fix that problem. There's rumbly, beefy, thin, powerless and anemic, powerful and full, woofy and woolly, muddy, flabby, warm, covered, boomy, empty, lax body, boxy, covered, nasally, distant, harsh, present, painful, shrill, piercing, dull, bright, dark. The thing about these tone words and tones in general is that they kind of have a reciprocal relationship, right? It's impossible for something to be really bright and really full and really present and have all the good things unless it's just really well balanced, right? You can't take something out of the normal or average and have it be average and everything else too. These tone words are relative to everything else. One phrase that stuck with me is that one man's warm is another man's dull. So there's that. Nothing is perfect, but identifying some of the frequency ranges and the balances of those frequencies helps you to identify what it is you want to accomplish with the EQ. As you're learning these different words, sometimes it can be helpful to understand that there are different widths to the different words. For instance, to me, piercing or shrill is very narrow in the high frequencies, whereas bright is kind of broad in the high frequencies. Now that we understand a little bit more about how the different frequency ranges feel, let's talk about how we can apply our understanding of the equalizer to that to hopefully make things sound better. In the beginner level, we just talked about the big picture frequency ranges that we're talking about. Now we're going to get a little bit more specific to fine-tune the different tonal aspects of our sounds. When tackling more specific frequency ranges, we're going to use the bell curve like we did in the middle band in our beginner section. It's going to have frequencies on either side that we choose to take with it, but we're also going to choose the center frequency on where that lies. Aside from choosing a more specific frequency range, we're also going to choose how many frequencies on either side, above or below that center frequency, we're going to adjust with our EQ, turning them up or down. This is called the bandwidth, or Q, of the frequency band. Q is a mathematic term that just means that a higher number means narrower and a lower number means wider. A good rule of thumb is to use a narrower bandwidth when we're cutting and a broader or wider bandwidth when we're boosting. This tends to sound more natural to our ears, and we can actually get away with a lot of narrow cuts that don't stand out as much as a small narrow boost would on an EQ. To avoid getting overwhelmed and to really try to hone in our ears to connect what it is that's happening with our EQ, set your gain to 0 and set your bandwidth to medium. Not super wide, not super narrow. Now, while you're listening to a sound that feels a little bit off, try to imagine what that tone word is making you feel, and then try to choose a frequency with your equalizer, then cut that one frequency to see if your problem went away or not. If you listen and evaluate and say, that did not help me, put it back up to 0, try a different frequency, and then try again. Not only is this exercise great for learning how to do it, it's also great for teaching somebody how to do it as well. Often we need to evaluate and kind of fine-tune our brain into perceiving tonal differences, and that sometimes can take a little bit of time to build up that perception and endurance. So if you don't hear things at first, don't worry, keep trying, you'll develop it over time. That is, unless you're totally tone deaf, and then you probably shouldn't be running sound. So the first one I'm going to show you is on a vocal, and normally you would have a live vocal that needs some other EQ things, and if you need to know about that, I've got a video up here in this corner that can show you how to take care of EQ on a live vocal, because it's just a little bit different. But this one was a studio vocal, but I'm going to show you how you can identify some mid-range frequencies to keep the vocal a little bit less covered. So let's listen to this one.
Now we sing glory to the righteous one. Glory to the righteous one. Glory, glory. Glory to. Now we sing glory to the righteous one. Glory to the.
So these small cuts make it a little bit more palatable to push up loud. So we're cutting some in the mid-range on two different frequencies, and sometimes that's what it takes with vocals, is there's no just one frequency to go for. You've got to learn to hear the different frequency ranges and balance that to get it to sound right and big out in front of the mix. Now, for certain instruments, you have to kind of learn what timbre they're gonna have and how to adjust for it. So something like a violin or viola could get very scratchy and could have something that jumps out and really hurts, especially when we're at high volumes. So understanding that for a viola or a violin, it could get scratchy and hurt right around 3.15K. That's the resonant frequency of many people's ear canals, although it varies from person to person and even from nationality to nationality. Ethnicity and body shape plays a role in this, but 3K is something that could be very painful for you. So being able to pull that out and have that as a safety first option can be very helpful, especially if we're trying to get it out in front of a big mix, but we don't want to hurt people. So listen as I pull out some 3K on this viola to make the possibility of it screeching a little bit lower.
No other God can.
It might sound better without that cut on studio monitors, headphones, or even through your phone. But in a live environment, if we're having to push that up really loud in front of a loud crowd even, we want to make sure that we're not going to hurt anybody. One thing that's very common on keyboards and pianos is for there to be buildups in the low mid-range at specific frequencies related to the notes that they're playing and their overtones. So one common place where frequencies build up is around 440 Hertz. So if I cut that on the piano, you can hear how it makes a little bit more room for the vocals. So let me cut this frequency by about 4 or 5 dB and see if you can hear a difference, especially on the way that the vocals have more room.
How we love your name, Jesus, you're the beautiful one. We love your name. How we love your name, Jesus, you're the beautiful one. We love your name. How we love your name. We love your name.
If the piano was by itself, it'd probably sound better with those frequencies up. But in the context of everything else, it sounds a little bit better tucking them back just a little bit. Now that we've mastered kind of the intermediate type of EQ, we can get a little bit more fine-tuned and move on to our advanced EQ type. And as you grow in identifying frequencies and being able to pull them out with your EQ more accurately, you can take it a step farther and fine-tune your ear training to identify different frequencies as sine waves or tones. Most often, this is found when we have a feedback frequency, or one frequency starts to ring, and we want to take the level of that frequency down relative to everything else so that it doesn't ring, but we can still turn that fader up and hear it just as loud as it was before. Other applications for very narrow, specific EQ cuts are with a surgical type EQ. And you can start to hear sometimes there can be frequencies that will resonate on one instrument that masks another instrument or vocal. In this case, we can try to find that one frequency that's really jumping out and cluttering everything else up. By taking a narrow cut of just that frequency, we can preserve all the other things that are awesome about that sound source without cluttering up and covering up something else. To do this, we're going to take a very narrow filter, and although most of the time I don't recommend this, we're going to boost and sweep near where we think that resonant frequency is. We don't want too big of a boost here, but enough that we can identify, oh yeah, that's the thing that's bothering me, and then we can cut it out. The reason I don't recommend you do this in the intermediate stage is we're trying to preserve our memory of what we wanted it to sound like in the first place, and when you boost and sweep, our memory can go away of what we wanted it to sound like in the first place. But when we're moving on to our advanced stage, we can use this narrow filter and boost just a little bit to sweep and find that thing that's bothering us and cut out just that frequency. Then the real trick is to take a second band at the same frequency that's set quite wide and boost up the frequencies on either side of that. That can help to minimize the effects or the other things that are going to be missing around that EQ point, and it makes it sound a little bit more natural. So on this electric guitar, I'm going to try to fine tune the EQ to take out a resonance that I think is covering up other stuff just a little bit, and then I'm going to kind of even out the tone with another EQ band at the same spot but wider with a little bit of a boost. So I can turn each one of the bands on and off so that you can hear what it's like, but you can understand what an advanced EQ technique is like and when we might use it.
How we love your name, Jesus, you're the beautiful one. We love your name, Jesus, you're the beautiful one. How we love your name. We love your name. Yeah, you're the beautiful one. How we love your name. You're the beautiful one. We love your name. How we love you. How we love you. King of kings. How we love you, Lord. How we love you, King. How we love you.
So that's an advanced EQ technique that you can work toward in addition to identifying frequencies and being able to pull them out when they start to ring like feedback. Now, if you're in the beginner stages of EQ and you want to take that leap and know what it is that I'm listening for when I'm listening to different inputs, I've got my live mixing field guide that you can buy, and it's got all my go-to frequencies on where I'm listening, on what I might want to adjust up and down on different instruments. You can find it at livemixingfieldguide.com, and I'll be sure to put a link in the description below as well. There's a video I found years ago of the guy that invented fully parametric EQ talking about how to do this, and it's really fascinating to watch him kind of figure out what frequency to cut and then how to take care of it. I'll throw the link to that video up here. Now, to really grow in identifying feedback frequencies, it's a similar process to learning ear training, like when you identify intervals or learning how to hear chord progressions. It's just a little bit different because we're trying to identify sine waves over the course of a bunch of octaves from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Usually it helps me to have a reference of something that I just know in my brain what that frequency is. For me, it's the ring on a snare, and that tends to live around 500 hertz. Then I can use relative pitch to say, is this above the ring on a snare or below the ring on a snare, to try to fine-tune where exactly that frequency is ringing. The ultimate goal is to be able to notch that frequency out on a 1/3 octave graphic EQ quickly. It can be helpful to have one of these patched across a group that your vocals are running through or any other feedback-prone inputs. You can also use an audio analyzer or RTA to identify what frequencies are ringing out more. I talk about this a little bit more in my Mixing with Smart video. You can check that out up here as well. Oh, and if you want to watch me go through the process in real time on a live stream from my phone, you can see how I did it at a live event that we were preparing for a few years ago. I'll throw that video up here too. Now, the key to really growing in EQ and developing your ear for it is to actually practice. And so that's why I set up the Virtual Soundcheck Challenge. Virtual Soundcheck is the way that you can record all your live inputs and then play them back through the soundboard so that if you're normally on stage, you can hear yourself and everybody else in your band the same way that the audience hears them. And because you're not relying on the band to be there right then, you can practice these things in the comfort of your own aloneness. You really get to dial in EQ and play with stuff that you wouldn't have time to normally. The Virtual Soundcheck Challenge is totally free and you can sign up through the link in the description below. I tell you how to set it up and what to practice once you do. So now that we've been through the beginner, intermediate, and advanced stages, where would you say you are right now and what are you going to do to move on to the next steps? I would love to hear about it. Drop it down in the comments below to let me know where you're at and what you're going to try next. Here at Attaway Audio, I'm here to eliminate the mystery and frustration with church sound. So if you're a worship leader or sound tech, you found the right place. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you liked this video, smash that thumbs up and share this with a friend that wants to get into audio and is learning how to EQ. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. Remember, it's all about the low end, avoid the sound tech solo, and nobody leaves humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.